Buddhism in China, from its inception through the Tang persecution of 842 through 845 of the Common Era. A videography by Brenda Smage. Buddhism is a tradition that has spread widely and changed vastly since its origination. China is among the areas influenced by the spread of Buddhism. While Buddhism was not immediately accepted in China, it flourished and had a great impact on Chinese culture. However, in the process, Buddhism itself was transformed. Many uniquely Chinese schools of Buddhism emerged in China during its period of acceptance. However, the golden age of Chinese Buddhism came to an abrupt end with the Tang persecution. Early cultural ties and trade between China and Central Asia provided the means for the entrance of Buddhism into China. When trade increased between China and Central Asia during the Han Dynasty in the 1st century of the Common Era, people began to learn about Buddhism. The arrival of Buddhist monks in the year 67 of the Common Era, including the monks Dharmaraksa and Kasyapa Matanga, is said to mark the official introduction of Buddhism in China. While these early contacts are important to note in the transmission of Buddhism into Chinese culture, the primary arrival of much Buddhist thought was along the Silk Road beginning in the 2nd century of the Common Era. In the 2nd century, there was further development of Buddhist communities in China, which can be traced back to the year 148 of the Common Era in Loyang, where until the end of the 3rd century of the Common Era a number of Buddhist translators and teachers were working. However, Buddhism did not immediately gain a large following, as it entered China during a period where the predominant religions of Confucianism and Taoism were already established and firmly in place. The meeting of Confucianism and Taoism with Buddhism is an important factor in the development of Chinese Buddhism, as Confucianism and Taoism had profound effects on the acceptance of Buddhism and the types of Buddhism that would flourish in China. Confucianism, one of the predominant religions in China, was based upon the hierarchical relationship of individuals and promoted social stability, order, strong families, and practical living. Buddhist concepts of monasticism and the enlightenment of the individual were in direct conflict with the Confucian ideals of the family and the emperor. This conflict is one of the reasons that Buddhism was not met with open arms in China. While Buddhist and Confucian ideals contradicted each other, Buddhism was less antithetical to Taoism, the other major religion of China. Yet Buddhism was not completely in line with Taoism, as Taoism is based upon the relationships between an individual and nature, and at its core Taoism sought harmony with the natural world, while Buddhism sought to master the inner world. However, due to some similarities between Buddhism and Taoism, Buddhism was initially considered to be a foreign corruption of Taoism. Thus, while Buddhism did not get off to a great start in China, by the 2nd century of the Common Era, aided to some extent by the simplicity of its approach and some similarities with Taoism, it managed to gain a firm foothold and acquired a sizable following. Other factors had an impact on the acceptance of Buddhism in China, such as the subsequent chaotic periods of 16 kingdoms and southern and northern dynasties, which changed the situation, resulting in state support of Buddhism. The Age of Division, which spanned from the year 220 to the year 589 of the Common Era, began with the fall of the Han Dynasty, and was marked by political division and governments unable to gain firm control of their territories. The Western Jin Dynasty united China briefly, but marked further erosion of centralized imperial control by their policy of parceling out enormous tracts of land to imperial princes. The imperial princes all sought the succession of the throne, which ended in many bloody struggles and a civil war that broke out in the capital between the years 291 and 305 of the Common Era. After the civil war that raged on in the capital, China remained a battlefield for over a century. This period is known as the 16 Kingdoms, and lasted from the year 304 to the year 439 of the Common Era. China was not easily unified, and the northern and southern regions of China remained under separate rule from the early 5th century of the Common Era through the late 6th century of the Common Era. While southern China remained under the rule of native dynasties whose rulers were devout Buddhists, northern China was under the control of non-Chinese rulers who showed favor for the Buddhist religion. The Buddhist rulers of southern China saw to the construction of numerous temples, participated in Buddhist ceremonies, and organized public talks on Buddhism. The Buddhists in southern China, which did not have a direct connection to Central Asia as did the Buddhists in northern China, worked to translate, interpret, and elaborate on the Buddhist texts and ideals by writing commentaries to fit within the framework of traditional Chinese philosophy and religion. In northern China, the centers of Buddhist learning were closer in contact with Central Asia, and awareness of the foreign origins of Buddhism was kept alive through the active and earnest efforts of translation. Buddhist art also flourished in the north in this period due to the royal patronage of the rulers who favored Buddhism. Along with the differences in respect to Buddhism in the north and south, the speed at which Buddhism spread in the regions was also different. While Buddhism spread slower in southern China due to the elite families that dominated politics, Buddhism spread more rapidly in northern China due to the social upheaval that worked to break cultural barriers between the elite ruling families and the general populace. With the weak governments of these times, confidence in the Confucian view of the social and political order declined, and people in all walks of life found hope in religions promising salvation and transcendence. These declines in trust of Confucianism led to an expansion of Taoism and the Buddhist religion in China. In this period, when it was difficult to place much faith in civil governments, China encountered a religion whose reach extended way beyond any known government. This religion was that of Buddhism. In the South, the upper classes often discovered Buddhism through their academic pursuits and the exploration of Neo-Taoism, while the sophisticated gentry dwelled on the philosophical and mystical aspects of Buddhism. The rural folk followed Buddhism in their own superstitious and simple ways, imparting to it in the process a peculiar Chinese character. The differential development of Buddhism among different social classes in China is part of what made Buddhism in China unique. However, while there were distinct forms of Buddhism among the different social classes, Buddhism also helped to transcend class differences, as inscriptions from members of all social classes can be seen on Buddhist statues and temples, suggesting that members from different social classes worked together on these projects. With the reunification of China under the Sui and Tang dynasties, Buddhism from northern and southern China cross-fertilized each other and strengthened the hold of Buddhism in Chinese society. The Sui and Tang dynasties were great patrons of Buddhism, and it was at this time that Buddhism reached its peak in China. It is the Tang Dynasty that is known as the Golden Age of Chinese Buddhism. Empress Wu, the only female to take the title of emperor in the history of China, was among the greatest patrons of Buddhism during the time of the Tang Dynasty. The empress gained much support for her advocacy of Buddhism. The empress also used Buddhism to legitimize her ascent to the throne and the establishment of the Zhou dynasty by circulating the Great Cloud Sutra, which predicted the imminent reincarnation of the Buddha Maitreya as a female monarch, under whom all the world would be free of illness, worry, and disaster. With state support of Buddhism, the religion was allowed to flourish in China. However, the spread of Buddhism would not have occurred without the dedication of Buddhist scholars who came to China from the East and worked selflessly to make Buddhism a mass religion. These Buddhist scholars worked at translating Buddhist texts into the Chinese language and forming teachings based on the Buddhist texts. One of the most well-known translators was Kumarajiva, who established the first imperial translation bureau in the north. Kumarajiva translated a large number of important texts and revised the earlier Chinese translations. His translations are still in use to this day. The buildings of monasteries and temples by devout Buddhists for the practice of the religion transformed the landscape of China, the beauty of Buddhist architecture appealing to people of all classes. With the massive increase of Buddhist texts in China, the Buddhists were left with the issue of how they would put their teachings into practice. Many different Buddhist schools arose, and each focused on certain Buddhist texts or doctrines for their study and practice of the religion. Among the many schools that arose,